Good evening. Okay, we're in good order. We're connected. It's a blessing to be with you tonight. I know the girls over here are excited for their week at Shine Camp. I'm so impressed by how much work goes into that, how many people behind the scenes are doing things and putting that together, and what a great endeavor of this congregation to build these ladies up in the words of the living God. I will say to you, before I speak to the entire audience, that your worth and all of it is found in the fact that you are daughters of God. You bear the image of God. Your worth and your perfection and your value and all of it is found in Jesus Christ and there alone. And this is a secure place to be. There's no other place in all the world that is secure like what it is to be in Jesus Christ. There are many that are looking now, that are looking right now for their purpose. And the thing is, they've been taught that all that they are is matter that came about through time and chance. And you wonder why there's so many that are in identity crises. That's what they were taught. You are just matter that came about by time and chance. And yet this is an unlivable conclusion. No intellectual person, no person who thinks through this can live with it. And so those that have concluded it try to find purpose in other ways. But our purpose and our worth and our value and all of it is found in Jesus Christ. We are not perfect on our own. We are not perfect in our actions. We are not perfect in our essence, nor in our being. And yet, because of the perfect work of Jesus Christ that He secured for us at Calvary, by being brought into Him, we are made perfect, and there we find our purpose. And so tonight, to kickstart Shine Week, I was asked to do a lesson that relates to our perfection in Jesus Christ, something that relates to what Jesus has done for us in the gospel. So I picked a scripture from Colossians chapter 1, verses 15 to 23. We're mainly going to just zoom in for a moment on verses 21 to 23, but I want to read all of it just to get the context for it. And in fact, the other verses we will be looking at in the coming weeks in our Sunday morning series. But look at the words of God with me. This is Colossians chapter 1. Speaking of Jesus, this is a powerful word. It says, Jesus is the image of the invisible God, the firstborn of all creation. It doesn't mean that He was created. It means that He's the most important thing of all creation. Why? Well, He answers it. He says, for, or because by Him all things were created. That's why He's the most important thing in all of creation. Because He is the one that made it all, in heaven and on earth, visible and invisible, whether thrones or dominions or rulers or authorities, all things were created through Him and for Him. And He, that is Jesus, is before all things. He is prior to all things. You can't go further back than Him. He's the bottom. He's the furthest back. He is the infinite one, and He is before all things. And in Him, in Jesus, all things hold together. I'm going to say more about this in the coming weeks, but this phrase, hold together, maybe a better way to translate it is cohere. They all cohere, everything finds its context and its meaning. What does it mean to be a human? Well, it finds it there. What is the purpose and the meaning of life? Well, it's found in Jesus. Everything coheres in Jesus. Implication being, outside of Jesus, there is no coherence at all. It is totally incoherent. There is no purpose, there is no meaning, there is only lostness outside of Him. Jesus is the one who holds all things together. He, Jesus, is the head of the body, the church. He is the beginning, the firstborn from the dead, so that in everything, He might be preeminent. For in him, in Jesus, all the fullness of God was pleased to dwell, and through him to reconcile to himself all things, whether on earth or in heaven, making peace by the blood of his cross. And you, who once were alienated and hostile in mind, doing evil deeds, he has now reconciled in his body of flesh by his death, in order to present you, listen to this, in order to present you holy and blameless and above reproach before him. If indeed you continue in the faith, stable and steadfast, not shifting from the hope of the gospel that you heard, which has been proclaimed in all creation under heaven, and of which I, Paul, became a minister. So I want to zoom in just on this verse that you see on the screen, just for a brief period of time tonight, just a simple exposition of this word, and where it all begins and where Paul says that you should go, just to take. I mentioned this recently. You've heard all your life that, or maybe you haven't. I heard it all my life. Familiarity breeds contempt. Familiarity breeds contempt. And I had some roommates in college that was absolutely true. Familiarity bred contempt. And by a month or two in, I don't want to be roommates with this guy anymore. So it did. But oftentimes, familiarity doesn't breed contempt. Oftentimes, it breeds apathy. That's what it oftentimes does. And I don't think that growing up as a Christian, you're likely to become, that being familiar with the Christian faith is going to make you contemptuous of it. You might be contemptuous of a false version of the Christian faith, or perhaps an inconsistent reflection of the Christian faith in another human being. But you probably won't be contempt of it. What you might become is apathetic. What you might become is, yeah, I've heard these stories since Sunday school. I heard them since kindergarten. I heard them when I was on Cradle Roll. I heard them all of this time. And that can happen. And one of the things that Paul does to safeguard against this is he says that it's helpful to remember who you once were, where you once were, what you once were prior to being in Jesus Christ. It's helpful to do that. Now the enemy, so what he's saying is look back. Think back to a prior point in your life. One of the things that the enemy will have you do, if he wants you to look back, he will either have you look back by way of nostalgia, so that you would come out saying, boy, weren't things good back then? I wish I could go back to that. And you can't, of course. Or he will have you look back by way of regret. What if I'd have done this? What if I had done that? I wish I'd done this other thing. And do you remember in Napoleon Dynamite when Uncle Rico was always wanting to go back to his football days? Does anybody remember that? And how he could throw a pigskin a quarter mile, and boy, if he had just won that state championship, he'd be an NFL player. And he's looking back by way of regret. Some look back by way of nostalgia. Neither one of those are helpful. We can't do anything about the past. It's frozen in time. But there's one aspect of looking back that's actually helpful for going forward. And it's looking back and remembering what we once were apart from the goodness and the glory that came in Christ. This is how you safeguard against apathy. He says, you who once were, just notice that phrase, you who once were, what were you? And Paul does this often. He says in Ephesians 2, remember that you, the Gentiles, the uncircumcision in the flesh, remember that you were at one time separated from Christ, alienated from the commonwealth of Israel. Remember that. Remember that that was your lot at one point. Paul says it here to the Colossians. You who once were, he says this is something that is helpful. Remember this was the state. Don't remember it by way of nostalgia. Don't remember it by way of regret. In terms of regret, Jesus has fixed it and has made it right. In terms of nostalgia, there's nothing back there to be nostalgic about. If we remember it rightly. Remember, he says, and you who once were, what does he say? He says two things. He says you once were alienated, and the other thing was you were hostile in mind. And so just let me briefly say a word about that. Alienated. We know one of the big terms. And y'all's generation, Gen Z and under, y'all's lingo is changing all the time. It's I can't keep up with it, but FOMO, is that still a thing that you guys use? No? My gosh, I'm getting total fear of missing out, FOMO. What was that, 2 years ago? Okay. Well, that was a term that I remembered using not that long ago. The fear of missing out. And it's kind of as somebody's doing it, well, I don't want to miss out, so I'm going to do it. Fear of missing out, fear of missing out. There's only one thing that we should fear missing out on, and it is being connected to Jesus Christ. There was a time when we were missing out on it. That's what alienation is about. You were alienated. You once were alienated. Alienated from what? What had he said in the verses prior to this about Jesus? In the verses leading up to this, what did he say about Jesus? He said he is the very center of the universe. It is by Jesus that everything finds its meaning, everything finds its context, everything is created through him. He made it all. It's all made for him. And therefore, if I'm alienated from him, I'm alienated from my purpose. And therefore, I'm moving about in life trying to do something I was not made for, kicking against the pricks. I am going about doing things that I was not made for, alienated from the very one that makes all of life cohere, alienated from the very one in whom I find my purpose. And the fact is this: you may, in this life, you may have the approval of kings and cultures and family members and peers. But imagine standing outside of the only one, the literal only one whose judgment about anything matters at all. And you and I will stand there one day. One day we will stand there. We will be face to face with our Maker. This is what life is about, is the restoration of that relationship that broke between mankind and God, and us all being brought together again. So he says, one time you were alienated. Now, how deep did the alienation go? How deep was it? Well, he says that the other thing he says is you were hostile in mind. Hostile, the word he uses there for hostile is a word that means enmity. There are foreign nations today. There are alien nations in the proper sense of that term that we would say they're not hostile nations. They're foreign nations. They are alien nations to us. There are people that don't share in the commonwealth of the United States. They don't share in the blessings of our Constitution or our free republic. And yet we wouldn't say that there's any hostility between us and them. There are many nations like this. But he says that this alienation that we once had, he says it actually ran as deep as being that of hostile terms. There was actually enmity. That's what the word is. There was enmity. There was hostility between us and God. He says that was your lot. I think about this often. I think about what would I do if I was God's enemy. First of all, how would I fight him? I could never win that battle. And so I would then turn to saying, well, I better run from him. But to where would I run? To what court could I appeal? Where could I go? Is there a worse condition, really and truly, is there a worse condition in all the world than to be at odds with the creator of the universe? No. And Paul says that's not the case for those that are in Jesus Christ. But remember that it once was. Think back to that. And then look at verse 22 and how he contrasts. Here's what he says is the reality now for those that are in Jesus Christ. And I just love this. This verse 22, he has now, he right here is Jesus. Jesus has now reconciled, let me change my color here. He has now reconciled, that's a big term, in his body of flesh by his death in order to present you holy and blameless and above reproach before him, before, that is, God. He says one time you were alienated, that is, you were separated from the very one that gives context to life, the very one that demands your destiny, or commands your destiny, excuse me. And at one time you were hostile in mind, you were enemies of God, but this is what Jesus has done. Those in Jesus, what it says is, he has now reconciled. Reconciliation, what is that? What is reconciliation? It is when there was odds between two, and the odds are removed, and now they're brought back together again. This means I'm no longer alienated from God. I'm not outside of him any longer. I'm not outside of Jesus, nor am I any longer under hostile terms. I'm brought into his presence in a good way. I'm brought into the presence of God, and the relationship there is restored. What that means is I'm no longer far off. It means that I'm no longer hopeless. It means that my teleos is restored. That means my end is now restored. We're all, time, have you ever realized this? Time only moves one direction, right? Tomorrow, when tomorrow comes, it won't be yesterday, will it? What will it be? It will be tomorrow. And in a year from now, it won't be last year, will it? We won't go back to 1999. Why not? Time only moves in one direction. And so the question, the big important question is since time is, there's a beginning here and it's only moving here, the big question ought to be in the mind of every person, what will be when I get to this ending point? What will be my end? Some only go so far as retirement. I'll have money in the bank. I'll relax and spend my final 10 years traveling the world. Some, that's as far as they go, but we know in our own mind that it goes far, much farther than that. And in Jesus, our end is restored. I now know where I'm going. I know who I'm going to. It is secured. It is hope-filled. So this is what Jesus has done. Now, here's the question. Where did it happen? Where did the reconciliation happen? Between two nations, it might happen in some fancy conference room, and you might have two military leaders that shake hands and a peace treaty is signed. Where did this reconciliation happen? Well, it says this. It says that, verse 22, he is now reconciled. Where was it? In what? In his body of flesh. That's where it happened. It happened in his body. And that's not metaphorical. That's literal. It was the Gnostics that denied this. This is literal. In the body of Jesus, that's where reconciliation happened. In the literal body of Jesus, that's where it happened. And the question is, why did it happen there? Why did it happen there in the body of Jesus? Well, look back up at verse 19. What does it say in verse 19? In him, that is, in Jesus, what does it say? All the fullness of God was pleased to dwell. Who was dwelling inside the perfect body of Jesus? The living God. And why is it that God found that a place to live and to inhabit? Why is it that God stayed there? Why was there no separation? Because of the perfection of Jesus. Because all he did every day of his life, from his first breath until his last, was live in perfect obedience to God. The relationship between Jesus the Son and Father God was never severed. And so God lived there, and when Jesus died there and God was in Jesus, Jesus' body now serves as a sacrifice for us to then come and approach God. What Paul says in Colossians and Ephesians is that through the body of Jesus, there was a bringing together of heaven and the things of earth. It is the conduit. It's the only way to bring together these two things that had been severed, heaven and earth. At one time they existed together. At one time they coexisted when God walked in the garden. And when man separated from God, it was broken. And God went higher and man went lower. And the only thing that has brought it back together is the body of Jesus. One time I witnessed a young girl, a toddler, and her parents were estranged. Mother and father were at enmity. And the little girl was witnessing this, and she was watching this, and she could see the hostility there. And she grabbed her daddy's hand, and then she grabbed her mommy's hand, and she literally brought them together and made them hold hands. This is what Jesus has done on a much, much, much bigger scale. He was already connected to God, and he reached down to earth, and he brought us back together again. This is what Jesus has done. Now, the other question is, why did he do it? And this is the big question. Why did Jesus do it? Why did God offer Jesus? Why did Jesus willingly go to be offered up? Well, he says it. It's this phrase in verse 22 where it says, in order to. Why did he do it? Why did he put his body on the cross? In order to present you. And how did he want to present you? Holy and blameless and above reproach before him. That's why he did it. Why did he go to Calvary? The sole reason was to present you holy and blameless and above reproach. Have you stopped to consider this? I only know me. I know others on a superficial level, but I know me very deeply. I was not holy. I was not blameless. And I certainly was not above reproach. Have you ever stopped to consider the awesome miracle that it is to, despite what you have done, despite the things you've done, the things you've thought, the things you've said, the places you've been, that were not above reproach, that were anything but holy, to despite that, to be able to exist before the throne of God in such a way that that's what he sees. He sees holiness. He sees blamelessness. He sees one that is above reproach. This is the gospel. It finds its context in the badness of what once was. It finds its context in the sinfulness that I once was, and how all of it has been restored, and I have been made holy, not by virtue of my own merit, but by virtue of the merit of Jesus the Christ. So this is the gospel in a nutshell, and I just want to close by giving you this admonition that Paul gives. This morning, Paul, you remember, Paul said that, there was this if we were talking about this morning. Well, there's another one here. He says, this is what's required of us. Verse 23. And I'll give this encouragement to the young ladies over here, as y'all have so much of your future ahead of you. Many of you are just beginning your faith journey, and there's so much to come. And perhaps some of you are still looking to put on Jesus Christ in baptism. I think there will be discussions to that end this week. But this is the encouragement for you and for everyone else. Verse 23, he says, you're holy, you're blameless, you're above reproach before God. And notice he doesn't say, if indeed you continue on perfectly in your conduct. Is that how he continues? Is that what he says? No. There will not be another day in your life where you live perfectly in your conduct. But there is something you can do. He says, if indeed, what should we do? If indeed you continue in the faith. Continue in the faith. And this is not just an assent to God. It's not just continuing to believe that God exists. That's not it. It's when you wake up in the morning, you say, I'm going to believe God today. What is God saying? I'm going to believe that. That's what I'm going to believe. God says that I'm his child. I'm going to believe that. God says that's a bad path. I'm going to believe that. I'm not going to go that path. That's what faith is. Faith is hearing God's word and just believing it. And he says this is how you will be saved. It will not be by absolute perfection or merit of your own. It will be by continuing in the faith. And then here's what he says. He says a couple things. He says stable. What does that mean? It's not a place where you put a horse. What is stable? You're not teetering. And I'll say this, here's where you find your stability. On the words of Jesus. Jesus says the wise man built his house on the rock. Whoever hears these words of mine and builds his life on it, that man can't be moved. That's where stability is found, is on those words. The longer I live, the more I know those are the only words I can stand on with any degree of confidence. So be stable in them, believe them, stand on them with all of your weight. Be steadfast. How do you do that? Well, one, you just tell yourself, I got to keep going. I have to keep pushing. But all through the Bible, there are those that have gone before us and they did it. And they're written there as examples for us. Look to them, see them, and continue in the same path as they. And then he says, lastly, not shifting from the hope. Not shifting from the hope, which this is a confident thing, of the gospel that you heard. Don't shift from it. The implication there, and I'm just going to close on this. This world's going to do everything to push you away from the hope of Jesus Christ. To say your hope's going to be found in this special interest group. Your hope will be found in living this kind of lifestyle. Your hope will be found in riches or in fame or in accolades or acceptance from peers, whatever. He says, don't shift from the hope of the gospel. That's your only hope. That's my only hope. It's certain. It's steady. It's sure. Don't shift from it. If people come along to push you, don't budge. Don't move. Hold your ground. Link arms together. Use one another to be strong. Draw into the church. Find counsel in the good wisdom of the elderly in your congregations. And do not shift from the hope. In not too many years, we will all be in future glory. God willing. In not too many years, we will all be in our eternity. And don't we wish to have continued in the faith when we get there? I certainly do. I know that you do too. And so let us be stable, let us be steadfast, and let us not shift from the hope of the gospel. If you have any need at all, there is an opportunity to let it be known while we stand and while we sing this song.